December 19, 1944, northeastern France. The road running northeast out of Nancy toward the Luxembourg border was frozen solid, not the soft freeze of early winter. The kind that crunches politely underfoot and yields by afternoon. This was the locked iron freeze of a continental winter that had come early, come hard, and showed no sign of negotiation. The mud that had swallowed axles and tank tracks throughout October and November had turned to stone. The fields on either side of the row sat under 4 inches of snow that had drifted in places to the height of a man's chest against the fence lines and the ruins of farmhouses that marked this particular stretch of liberated France. A convoy of vehicles was moving northeast along that road, staff cars, Jeep escorts, a communications truck. At the center of the column, a 4-door Dodge command car flew to flags from its front fenders, both bearing the 4 stars of a full general. The man inside that vehicle was 60 years old. He had been in uniform for 38 years. He had commanded armies in North Africa, in Sicily, and now in the largest ground campaign the Western Allied forces had yet attempted on the European continent. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. And on this particular morning, he was not in a good humor. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, stories where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and unique logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing and it tells us this work is worth continuing. He had reason. 3 days earlier on December 16, the German army had launched what would become the largest offensive operation undertaken by German forces on the Western Front since the fall of France. In 1940, 25 German divisions, roughly 200,000 men, had struck through the Ardennes forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, hitting the American 8 corps along an 80 meters front that had been held thin, deliberately underthin. Because Allied command had judged the Ardennes a quiet sector, it was quiet no longer. The 8 corps was being shattered. The town of Bastogne was about to be surrounded. An entire armored division, the 106th Infantry Division, was in the process of losing 2 of its regiments to encirclement and eventual surrender. It was the worst American military crisis since the opening weeks of the Pacific War, and Patton had been asked to fix it on December 18th. At a conference in Verdun, a city whose name carried its own weight of historical catastrophe. General Dwight Eisenhower had asked his senior commanders how quickly they could respond. Patton had told him 3 days. He could have 3 divisions moving north into the Ardennes within 72 hours. The other officers in the room had not believed him. Some had privately called it fantasy. Patton's own staff, who had been working the logistics quietly in advance for exactly this possibility, knew it was not fantasy. It was planned. It was executable. It was already in motion. But executing a rapid offensive reorientation, swinging 3 divisions 90 north from their existing attack axis in less than 3 days, in the worst winter weather Central Europe had produced in decades, was not a clean operation. It was a sustained exercise in controlled chaos, and along every row, feeding north toward the Ardennes. The machinery of that reorientation was visible. Columns of trucks, artillery pieces undertow, infantry riding half-frozen on the engine decks of Sherman tanks because there were not enough trucks to carry them and they would not be left behind. Patton's convoy was moving through that machinery. When the vehicle slowed, the command car had not stopped for a mechanical reason. It had slowed because the road ahead was partially obstructed. A column of men was being moved along the road's right shoulder on foot in loose formation without weapons, their hands clasped behind their heads or hanging slack at their sides. There were several hundred of them. They were German. Their uniforms, felt gros coats, some with the collar insignia of the Wehrmacht infantry, others with the darker piping of Waffen-SS auxiliary units, were heavily soled and, in several cases, torn. A portion of these men were not walking. They had been directed off the road's shoulder and into the adjacent field, and there in the snow, they were sitting or lying in irregular clusters. watched over by a small number of American military policemen and a single rifle platoon from what the markings identified as AR. Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. Patton directed his driver to stop. He got out of the vehicle. What he saw when he walked toward the edge of the field has been described with varying degrees of precision in several accounts written after the war. Patton's own diary, which he maintained with considerable regularity and candor throughout the campaign, contains a brief entry from this period. His ADA at the time, Colonel Charles Cotman, described the incident in letters written home that were later published. The Third Army's own after-action administrative records from December 1944 contain marginal references to prisoner handling protocols that were revised in this period. And at least 2 of the American soldiers present that morning gave accounts in the decades following the war to regimental historians and oral history projects. The picture those sources compose is consistent. There were men lying in the snow who were not dead. Some were wounded, not critically, but wounded enough that they had ceased to move. Others appeared to be sleeping. The temperature had not risen above 15 for 3 days. Several of the men lying in the snow had lost their outer coats, either surrendered, confiscated, or simply gone missing in the confusion of capture and transit. At least a handful showed the early visible signs of frostbite, the bluish-white discoloration of extremities, particularly ears and fingers, that indicates tissue damage and, if untreated, progresses to necrosis within hours. The American Guards were not negligent men. They were exhausted men. They had been in continuous contact with German forces for nearly a week. They had their own casualties. They had their own frostbite cases. They had been given no shelter for the prisoners because there was no shelter available. Every building within 4 miles had been requisitioned for one military purpose or another, or was already occupied by American wounded. The prisoners had been moved here because here was where there was space. The field existed. The snow was already on the ground. The logic, such as it was the logic of a system under maximum load, parceling out its insufficient resources in the order they arrived. Patton understood all of that. He had built the system he was looking at. He also knew what he was seeing was not acceptable. The remarks Patton made at that field have been recorded in at least 2 distinct forms. Colonel Cotman's account, the more restrained of the 2, describes Patton as addressing the officer in charge of the prisoner detail, a lieutenant with a controlled but pointed set of instructions. Patton did not shout. Those who knew him well noted that his most serious moments were often among his quietest. He asked the lieutenant how long the men in the field had been there. He was told since the previous evening, approximately 14 hours in sub-freezing conditions without adequate cover. Patton said, according to Cotman, these men are prisoners. They are not dead yet. While they are alive and in our custody, they will be treated as live prisoners. He then directed that shelter be located within the hour. He directed that a medical team be brought to assess the men showing signs of cold injury. He directed that rations be distributed, not the full combat ration issued to American troops, but sufficient to prevent active starvation. And he directed that the lieutenant's commanding officer be informed that the handling of prisoners in the Third Army area of operations was to conform to the standards required under the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, regardless of tactical conditions on the ground. The lieutenant, by several accounts, attempted to explain the logistical situation. There was no shelter. The nearest aid station was handling American casualties. The ration situation was constrained. Patton's response to this, the specific words, varies between accounts. The version that entered regimental oral history passed down through interviews collected in the 1970s and 1980s is more blunt than Cotman's rendering. In that version, Patton looked at the men in the snow and said something to the effect of, "I don't care what uniform they're wearing. A man freezing to death in the snow is still a man. Find them a barn." Whether those were the precise words or a later compression of a longer exchange cannot be verified absolutely. What can be verified is the outcome. Within 40 minutes of Patton's intervention, The prisoner group was moved to a collection of farm outbuildings approximately 600 meters from the road. An aid station team diverted from a transit route was tasked to the site. The men with the most severe cold injuries were transported to a rear area facility. The remainder received shelter, water, and a field ration distributed under American guard. Of the 340-odd prisoners logged in that group, no deaths from cold exposure were recorded in the subsequent 2 weeks. 3 men required medical amputation of necrotic tissue, 2 toes in one case, a portion of 2 fingers in a second, a single toe in the third. The rest recovered. This incident did not make the newspapers. It was not cited in Patton's famous public addresses. It appeared briefly in Third Army administrative correspondence and vanished into the archive. It was not the largest or most consequential thing Patton did in December 1944, measured against the Battle of the Bulge, against the relief of Bastogne, the death toll of the Ardennes campaign. The 75,000 American casualties recorded in that single engagement. The episode of the prisoners in the snow was a footnote, but footnotes have their own weight, and this one opens into something worth examining carefully to understand why Patton reacted as he did, and why his reaction was neither simple nor uncontested. You have to understand the man's relationship with the laws of war, which was not the relationship that later mythology assigned to him. George Patton is remembered in the popular imagination primarily as an instrument of violent forward momentum, the slapping incidents in Sicily, the speeches that featured language no longer printable in family publications, the theatrical pistols, the ivory-handled revolvers that were not ivory but pearl. These elements of the Patton legend have a way of crowding out other dimensions of the man, and there were other dimensions. Patton had studied military history with a thoroughness that was not common even among professional officers of his generation. He had read the classical campaigns. He had read Clausewitz and Germany. He had studied the Napoleonic Wars not as abstract theory, but as operational case studies in logistics, maneuver and the management of armies across sustained periods of effort. He had a particular and genuine interest in what happened to armies and to armies' reputations when discipline collapsed. He had seen what happened at Malmedy on December 17, 1944. One day after the German offensive began, soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstander SS Adolf Hitler had shot approximately 84 American prisoners of war in a field near the town of Malmedy, Belgium. The men had been captured during the opening hours of the offensive and were being held in the field when the shooting began. The precise sequence of events has been debated by historians for 80 years, but the result was not in doubt. 84 American prisoners already disarmed were shot. 43 survived by feigning death or fleeing into the surrounding woods. The news of Malmedy spread through the American forces with the speed that bad news always travels in an army, faster than orders, faster than supply convoys, faster than almost anything except the worst weather. It produced in the American ranks a predictable and understandable fury. It also produced in the weeks and months that followed a series of incidents in which German prisoners were shot or abused by American soldiers, sometimes in retaliation, sometimes in preemptive fear, sometimes in the compounded exhaustion and rage of men who had been fighting in sub-zero conditions for weeks and had seen their friends die. Patton knew about these incidents. He did not publicize them, but he knew about them. His diary and his correspondence during this period show a man actively conscious of the distinction between what Malmedy represented, a war crime committed as a matter of policy by a specific SS formation, and what Patton's own command could afford to become, not merely on ethical grounds, though those grounds existed for Patton more than the mythology suggests, on practical grounds, on the grounds of what happens to armies that abandon the discipline of the laws of war. Armies that shoot prisoners or allow prisoners to die of preventable cold create a reciprocal dynamic. Enemy soldiers stop surrendering. They fight longer because the alternative is worse. Surrenders that might have come quickly and cheaply in terms of time and American casualties are instead converted into firefights. Men on Patton's side died because the men they were fighting had no safe option other than to keep fighting. This was not an abstraction for Patton. This was arithmetic. The Ardennes campaign was at the time of the prisoner incident on December 19, not yet decided. The outcome that we know, the ultimate failure of Operation Wartime, the German retreat. The eventual Allied victory in the West was not visible to anyone standing in that frozen field in northeastern and France. What was visible was a genuine military crisis of the first order. The German plan, as conceived by Hitler and developed over the objections of several senior or match commanders, including Gervin Rundstedt and Walter Model, was predicated on a rapid breakthrough to the port of Antwerp. If the Germans could reach Antwerp, if they could split the Allied line and cut off the British and Canadian forces in the north from the American forces in the south, they might force a negotiated peace in the West that would allow Germany to concentrate its full remaining military strength against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. It was a plan that required speed, surprise, and the capture of Allied fuel depots because the German armored forces executing the attack were operating on fuel margins that left almost no room for deviation. The lead elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the unit that had committed the Malmedy massacre, had burned through so much fuel in the first 48 hours of the offensive that they were by December 18th stalled on roads that were blocked by their own traffic and waiting for resupply that was itself being strangled by Allied air. The Allied air forces had not been effective in the opening days of the Bulge. The same weather that had frozen the prisoners in the field had grounded most tactical aircraft across the entire theater. But the forecast was changing. By December 23rd, the skies would clear, and when they cleared, the American and British fighter bombers would be in the air with a completeness and ferocity at the German supply columns, now exposed on the roads through the Ardennes, could not survive. Patton's Third Army was the instrument of the ground response. The 3 divisions he had promised at Verdun, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, were now moving north. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was the point of the spear. It would ultimately reach the perimeter of Bastogne on December 26, breaching the German encirclement and resupplying the 101st Airborne Division, which had held the town against repeated German assaults for 8 days with minimal ammunition, inadequate medical supplies, and a now famous refusal to surrender. But on December 19th, all of that was still in the future. The outcome was not determined, and in a field off the road northeast of Nancy, a general stood looking at men sleeping in the snow. There is a tendency in historical storytelling to construct a clean moral architecture around moments like this one. The general who ordered humane treatment for enemy prisoners becomes in that architecture a symbol of restraint of civilization, of the principled conduct of war. The story becomes a parable that is not quite accurate to the historical record, and honoring the historical record means resisting the parable. George Patton was not a man of uniform humanitarian impulse. The same man who directed that German prisoners received shelter and medical attention on December 19th had 2 days later driven north past columns of American dead laid along the roadside, and expressed no public sentiment about it at all because American dead were in his operational framing a cost of the battle he was fighting, a cost he had calculated and accepted. He was not indifferent to those deaths. His diary shows a man in whom the weight of command casualty accumulated with a kind of chronic pressure, but he did not stop for American dead on the road. He did not stop to eulogize them or to instruct their surviving comrades in their humane treatment. They were dead. The mission moved north. What he stopped for was something different. He stopped because something was wrong in a way that had operational consequences. He stopped because men freezing to death in American custody were a problem with a solution, and the solution was accessible and no one had applied it. He stopped because he was the ranking officer present, and the system that had placed those men in that field was his system. This is a harder kind of humanity than the parable version. It is conditional. pragmatic and aware of its own limits. It does not generate the warm internal certainty of a moral absolute, but it is the version that actually happened, and it is worth more as history and a cleaner story that did not. The 1929 Geneva Convention, which Patton referenced in his instructions to the lieutenant that morning, had been signed by the major powers, including Germany, and established a framework for the treatment of prisoners of war that covered food, shelter, medical care, the prohibition of coercive interrogation, and the obligation of detaining powers to maintain records of prisoners and notify their home nations through neutral intermediaries. Germany had signed it. The United States had signed it. Germany's actual adherence to the convention had been at best selective throughout the war. On the Eastern Front, where the WWII was fighting against Soviet forces whom Nazi ideology explicitly classed as racially inferior subhumans, the convention had been systematically disregarded from the first week of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by German forces during the war, approximately 3.3 million, nearly 60%, died in German captivity. The majority in the first 2 years of the Eastern Campaign from starvation, exposure, shooting, and disease. This was not a casualty rate produced by difficult logistics, it was produced by deliberate policy on the Western Front. Germany's treatment of American and British prisoners had been meaningfully better, not uniformly so, not without serious violations, but better in systematic terms. American prisoners held in the main P camp system, the stalags, were not being starved to death. They were being inadequately fed and inadequately sheltered in conditions that deteriorated markedly as the German logistic system collapsed in late 1944. But they were being maintained within a range of treatment that bore at least a partial relationship to the convention's requirements. The distinction was not accidental. Germany treated Western Allied prisoners differently than Soviet prisoners for reasons that were explicitly ideological. The Soviets were subhuman per the Nazi framework. The Americans and British were at minimum racially acceptable, misguided enemies to be defeated, but not subjects of the same programmatic extermination that governed Eastern Front policy. American adherence to the convention was also imperfect. The historical record of American prisoner handling in the European theater of operations contains documented episodes of prisoner abuse, unauthorized shootings, and deaths from neglect that have been examined by historians, including Stephen Ambrose, who addressed related questions in his work on the European campaign, and by John McManus, whose more recent scholarship on the Third Army and its operations in 1944 and 1945 has been among the most rigorously researched accounts of the period. The picture is not clean. The picture of any army in sustained high-intensity combat is not clean. What Patton's intervention on December 19 represented was not the elimination of that ambiguity. It was a single correction made by a single senior officer at a single point in a vast and imperfect system. It mattered to the 340 men in that field. It mattered to the 3 who would have required more severe medical amputations had they remained in the snow another night. It probably mattered in small and unmeasurable ways to the operational climate of prisoner handling in the Third Army area over the weeks that followed, because senior commands take their cues from what the commanding general notices and reacts to. Beyond that, its effects are difficult to measure and probably should not be overstated. The man who had been directly addressed by Patton, the lieutenant commanding the prisoner guard detail, was a 23-year-old officer from the 4th Infantry Division, whose regiment had been involved in the early stages of the Bulge fighting and had taken significant casualties in the opening German assault. His name appears in several of the oral history accounts gathered in the 1970s, though privacy considerations have kept his full name for most published versions of the incident. He is identified in those accounts by his first name and his unit designation. By the accounts of the men who were present, He was not a bad officer or a negligent one. He had been awake for approximately 30 hours at the time of Patton's arrival. He had two soldiers in his detail who were themselves showing early signs of cold injury. He had the previous evening requested guidance from his company commander about shelter options for the prisoners and had been told there was nothing available. He had placed the prisoners in the field because it was the largest open space in the area that could be watched by his reduced complement of guards without requiring them to enter buildings and lose visibility. His operational logic was defensible. His resource situation was real. He was doing as best he could determine what was possible given what he had not done. And this in the most precise terms was what Patton corrected was push hard enough on the system above him to find an alternative. The farm outbuildings that ultimately housed the prisoners had been located in 40 minutes. They had been available. No one had looked hard enough for them before Patton arrived because the lieutenant had taken the first answer he was given. There is no shelter as final rather than as a starting point. This is not a criticism of the lieutenant. It is a description of what exhaustion does to decision-making, which is one of the most consistent and consequential dynamics in any extended military operation. Armies are not defeated only by enemy fire. They are defeated or they defeat themselves when the accumulated weight of fatigue and information overload and operational pressure degrades the cognitive processes of the individual soldiers and officers who comprise them. The lieutenant had not stopped thinking. He had not become cruel or indifferent. He had become tired enough at the boundary of what was possible had contracted to match the boundary of what he had already tried. Patton, arriving fresh from his command car and backed by 4 stars and an institutional imperative that did not allow for first answers, pushed that boundary back to where it actually was. By the afternoon of December 19, 1944, Patton's convoy had continued northeast toward the operational front. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its most critical phase. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne had been surrounded since the 20th. The 4th Armored Division's lead elements were fighting their way north along roads at the German 5th Parachute Division was caught, sting aggressively and at considerable cost to both sides. The weather remained locked. No air support was available. The fighting was ground fighting, close and brutal in conditions of cold and limited visibility that made every tactical movement and exercise in controlled suffering. On December 22nd, the German commander at Bastogne, Major General Heinrich von Luttwitz, sent a formal written surrender demand to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne. McAuliffe's response, a single typed word, nuts, delivered by 2 of his staff officers to the German emissaries under a white flag, is among the most cited American military communications of the war. What is less often noted is that McAuliffe, in delivering that response, was making a calculation similar to the one Patton had made 2 days earlier on the road outside Nancy. The assessment that holding a position and maintaining the integrity of the command was worth the cost of the alternative. The alternative for McAuliffe was surrender. The cost of holding was measured in the 101st Airborne's casualty list, approximately 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing during the siege of Bastogne alone. The cost of the alternative was harder to calculate. It would have shortened the immediate suffering of the men under his command. It would also, in the assessment of virtually every military historian who has examined the campaign, have materially extended the German offensive's operational reach and potentially allowed the German and armored formations to reach the Meuse River, the next significant terrain obstacle before the Allied response could be consolidated. The weight of Bastogne's resistance against the German timetable was in retrospect one of the decisive logistical facts of the campaign. Patton arrived at Bastogne on December 26. His reaction to what he found inside the perimeter, the condition of the men, their equipment, their casualties, was recorded by Colonel Cotman and by several other members of the 3rd Army staff. He was visibly affected. He had ordered those men indirectly to hold a position he had promised to relieve in 72 hours. He had missed that deadline by 4 days. He did not say much about it publicly. He said, rather a great deal about it in private in his diary in terms that were neither theatrical nor composed for an audience. Hence, the question that the incident of December 19th poses, what Patton said when he saw prisoners sleeping in snow and why he said it does not have a single register answer. It is not purely a story about compassion. It is not purely a story about operational practicality. It is a story about the relationship between command, responsibility, and the particular kind of clarity that sometimes arrives when a senior officer is forced to see a consequence of his own system that he had not directly intended. Patton had not intended for prisoners to freeze. He had also not intended specifically to prevent it. The Third Army's administrative and logistical structures in December 1944 were overwhelmingly oriented toward the forward, toward the offensive, toward the delivery of firepower and supply to combat units pushing north into the Ardennes. Prisoner handling was a rear function. Rear functions were understaffed. Understaffed rear functions under the pressure of a sudden crisis produced the field outside Nancy. Hundreds of men in the snow, a tired lieutenant, and a four-star general stepping out of a command car into a situation that had not been specifically planned for because no one had planned specifically enough. This was not unique to the Third Army. It was not unique to December 1944. It is not unique to any army in any war in any century. The history of military operations is full of these gaps. The places where the planning met the reality and found that reality had not read the plan. What varies is what happens in the gap. In this case, what happened was this: a general arrived. He looked at the gap. He identified a solution that was available but had not been applied. He directed that it be applied. He continued north. That is the event, that is the full event, without embellishment and without reduction. The Battle of the Bulge formally ended on January 25, 1945. The German offensive had failed. The 1st SS Panzer Division and the other German armored formations that had driven so rapidly into Belgium and Luxembourg in December had been ground down by American resistance. Allied air power once the weather broke, and the simple brutal arithmetic of a German logistic system that could not sustain what it had begun. The total American casualties in the Ardennes campaign were approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, missing, and captured. German casualties are estimated between 60,000 and 100,000, with significant variance in the historical record due to the destruction of German military records in the final months of the war. Belgian and Luxembourg civilian casualties often omitted from the primary statistical summaries numbered in the thousands. The Third Army's relief of Bastogne on December 26, completed by the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve under Lieutenant Colonel Cratton Abrams, a man who would later command U.S. forces in Vietnam and whose name would be given to the main battle tank that succeeded the Sherman, became one of the most celebrated operational achievements of the American Army in the European theater. It was celebrated rightly. It required what Patton had promised: a 90 reorientation of 3 divisions in 3 days in sub-zero temperatures over frozen roads against active German opposition. It also required everything that made the operation possible, including the small corrections made along the way, the decisions about what was acceptable and what was not. The moments where an officer at any rank looked at a situation and said, "This can be done better," and then did it better. The German prisoners who were moved from the field outside Nancy on December 19th were eventually processed through the Third Army's prisoner of war system, and in most cases ended the war in detention camps in France and the United Kingdom. A portion were repatriated to West Germany in 1946. Some went to the Soviet zone. The historical record does not track them individually beyond the Third Army's administrative log entry for that group. He slept in a barn that night instead of in the snow. The 3 men who lost portions of their extremities, the frostbite had those losses and no greater ones. The rest recovered. George Patton died on December 21, 1945. Exactly 1 year and today after the incident near Nancy from injuries sustained in a vehicle. Accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 6 years old. He was buried at his own request among the men of the Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge in the American military cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg. History does not often preserve the names of the men who were called. In a field on a December morning in 1944, it preserves the names of generals and battles and turning points. It preserves the famous refusals and the famous advances. It does not usually preserve the 40 minutes between the arrival of a command car on a frozen road and the movement of several hundred men from snow to shelter. But those 40 minutes existed. They were documented imperfectly, but verifiably in diaries and letters and administrative records that have survived in archives. They involved real men making real decisions with real consequences that were small by the scale of the war and not small to the men involved. That is the nature of most of history. It is not a series of turning points. It is a sequence of moments, most of them undocumented, in which human beings made decisions under conditions they had not fully chosen. The documented moments, the ones we can examine and attempt to understand, are windows into the undocumented mass of moments that surrounded them. What it shows is not a heroic portrait. It is a portrait of a specific man in a specific institutional role encountering a specific failure of his own system and correcting it with the resources he had available. It shows the limits of planning and sustained military operations. It shows what fatigue does to the boundaries of perceived possibility. It shows the difference that rank and authority make. The difference between a question that cannot be pushed further and a question that when pushed further finds an answer in 40 minutes. And it shows men sleeping in snow and a general who stopped to notice. If you are watching this, you are separated from those men by 8 decades. The cold they felt is beyond your direct knowledge. The specific weight of that morning, the smell of the frost, the sound of distant artillery, the exhaustion that made a frozen field seem like an acceptable solution cannot be transmitted across that distance with perfect fidelity. But the record remains. The documents survive. The accounts of the men who were there, preserved in regimental archives and published memoirs and oral history collections, remain accessible to anyone willing to look for them. That is how history is kept, not by monuments or mythology, but by the preservation and careful reading of the small, imperfect, specific record of what happened. That record deserves the attention.